Seems alright, quite a few people choose that, but I'd be very interested in down. I'll start and then somebody will always arrive just after you've started, actually, so don't start. Well, good evening and welcome to our, quite sad that it's our final Lent talk. Massive thank you to Andrew for coming along. It's a bit nerve-wracking emailing retired deans, you think, well, he'll never want to come to our Lent course, but he emailed back within half an hour, I think, saying I'd love to come. So I'm delighted. He was curate at Manston, which is my sending church. He'd left about 2 months before I arrived, but I used to hear all about him. So I knew he was good from then, and then had various ministry around here, I gather, including chaplain at Agnes Stewart. Yes, so... But we don't want you to talk about chaplaincy particularly because Kay did that rather wonderfully. But for a long time in cathedral ministry, it's been really good for me to have my mind broadened and just think about how we're all one church and so different and so similar, as we heard when Stephen was talking of church in rural Yorkshire Dales. It's so different, but it's exactly the same. So I will hand over to Andrew. I think he's going to open in prayer for us. Are you lovely?
I am going to, and thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for turning up this evening. And when I walked up the church path, I just thought, what an amazing welcome. Those daffodils are just tremendous. What a joy to come into church and be greeted in that way. So if you've got anything to do with the churchyard, thank you very much. And I mean that as someone who loves daffodils. I'm going to just start with a reading. Can everyone hear okay? I'm just going to start with a reading from Genesis, and then I'll follow that up with a prayer. So this is Genesis 28, beginning at verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob woke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Let us pray. Loving God, draw us on the journey to the places of holiness, the places of peace, the places of fellowship, the places of encounter, the places of beauty, the places where faith has been lived, your love made known, your hope held out in the past, for the present, into your future. Amen. It's nice to be able to come and talk about something I feel as though I know something about. It's always awful when you're asked to go and talk about something you know absolutely nothing about, but as a clergyman, I've got used to just talking. So I hope I've covered up my ignorance over the years to some extent. That prayer was, in fact, never really used. So there is something called the Association of English Cathedrals, the AEC, which is a kind of a club for all the cathedrals in the country. And the administrator of administrators is the sort of chief executive of it. And she, Sarah, who's retiring on Thursday, she helps administrators of cathedrals to understand all the ins and outs of the cathedral measure, which is the church measure that helps to govern us, and I'll come to that in a bit. But also what else is happening in the world, net zero, how you might tackle that, and all the kind of things, where to get a bit of money from. Anyway, in the year 2000, there was going to be a year of pilgrimage for the cathedrals of England, and the nation was going to be invited to go on pilgrimage around the cathedrals. And so, as someone who was always asked to write prayers for various things for the Church of England and cathedrals, I got an email from Sarah saying, could you write us a prayer that would go on a prayer card that could be used in all the cathedrals in England during the 2020 year of pilgrimage? So I sat down and wrote my prayer, sent it off, and then COVID struck. And the prayer card never got printed, the prayer never got prayed, and we never had the year of pilgrimage, and the rest is history. So when I came here, it was delightful to be able to dust it off and to be able to use it with you, because I thought it fitted to some extent with what I want to say to you. And there will be a couple of opportunities for you to ask me any questions. So I hope that, if you've got a question, you will ask about cathedrals or anything else. To be perfectly honest, there's always lots to ask about within the Church of England. To be honest, I kind of fell into cathedral ministry. The truth is that before I went down from Leeds to Southwark, my contact with cathedrals was minimal. I was ordained in 1983 in Ripon Cathedral, and then went back the following year to be ordained as a priest. As a child growing up in Leicester and being in our parish church choir, we had been taken every year to Leicester Cathedral, long before it had a dead king blocking up its chancel. But it was a gloomy hole, I have to tell you. It really was. I mean, I don't particularly like what they've done to it, but it's less gloomy than it was. And there were no toilets at all in this place. And my sister was in the choir as well. And she was going through one of those phases where she had to go to the loo every 5 minutes, which caused the women who went with us from the choir a bit of a problem, because they had to run across to the bus station opposite in their cassocks in the middle of all the rehearsals to take Jane off to the loo. So thank goodness now there's a nice bank. They should be memorialised to my sister, really, Jane's toilets at Leicester Cathedral. But there we sang the RSCM annual festival, which is what used to happen. And of course, I'd visited lots of cathedrals as a tourist. As I say, growing up in Leicester, Coventry was nearby. A good day out place as far as my mum and dad were concerned. They, for some reason, wanted us to see what a pedestrianised city centre looked like. I mean, we just lived for pleasure as a family. And they wanted us to see the newly built or rebuilt cathedral. Coventry Cathedral, we thought, was amazing. So different in many ways to our medieval parish church, though interestingly now, when you go to Coventry, it was designed by Basil Spence just before Vatican II really came onto the books. And the Second Vatican Council, which I know was about the Roman Catholic Church, but it affected the whole of the Western Church and really made us all reconsider the shape of our liturgical spaces and the look of our liturgy. It wasn't just Roman Catholic churches that pulled the altar forwards and things like that. It was all of the Western churches. So if Coventry had been designed 10 years later, it would not have looked like Coventry Cathedral looks, which is very medieval actually when you look at it. But, as a 7-year-old, I didn't know anything about any of that. So it looked very different. It wasn't just the scale, it was the art as well. That Sutherland tapestry that greets you as you come through those glass doors at the West End. And the Piper glass gleaming out, sort of intensifying the sunlight when the sun shines in Coventry. And that huge font, I love the baptistry, that massive font hewn from a piece of rock from Galilee, and that fantastic significance of things like that. It was startling. But I never found in me any affection for cathedrals and for cathedral worship. I didn't know how to engage with worship from what felt to be a passive onlooker perspective. As a young Anglo-Catholic, it felt too Church of England, if I may put it like that. Surplice, scarf and hood, choir dress, copes, a lot of walking about, vergers with wands, processions, and all dominated by a choir singing music I wasn't familiar with. Our choir at church was not good enough to tackle Byrd and Palestrina, so a great deal of what was going on in the cathedral felt very alien to me. I was very happy here in Leeds, in the old Diocese of Ripon. As has been said, I was a curate at St James Manston in Crossgates, and then moved down the York Road to Richmond Hill, Cross Green and East End Park, finally becoming the vicar of All Saints York Road, St Hilda's Cross Green and St Saviour's Leeds, which you may be familiar with. Sadly, All Saints, as you know, is no more. What I did discover, however, was a desire to learn more about liturgy and something of an ability to share my understanding of liturgy in theoretical and practical ways. There was a curate at that stage at St George's Leeds, which St George's Leeds wasn't my natural place to go to church, but I became very friendly with David, and we became the diocesan odd couple, leading liturgical training sessions across the diocese as new texts in those sort of mid-80s years started to become available. Things like Lent, Holy Week and Easter, and the promise of his glory that may well be on somebody's shelves from when they came out. There's loads in the vestry. I wasn't going to make that comment, but I assumed there would be. And we used to help to present these and interpret them for Catholics and evangelicals alike. But in 1994, I was asked to become the chaplain to the Bishop of Southwark. That meant a huge change for me, moving from Leeds, which had become my home, to London. Moving from being a parish priest to being a priest without a church, without a congregation, with just a bishop to care for. But despite all my misgivings, I was excited by the prospect, and that was why I said yes to the offer. So in 1995, I moved and found myself in South London. And that is where I fell into cathedral life. One of the jobs of a chaplain then, now they spend most of their time, and I really mean this, they spend most of their time dealing with safeguarding, was to liaise between the bishop and the cathedral. Southwark was and is quite a liturgical diocese, and so the bishop was often involved in a service in the cathedral. So I quickly got to know the canon precentor and the succenter and the staff that they worked with. And they also invited me to become a priest vicar at the cathedral, as they recognized the fact that I had no altar now where I could preside at the Eucharist. And that had been a central, almost defining aspect of my ministry here in Leeds. I kind of understood priesthood from the perspective of being at the altar, celebrating the Eucharist, celebrating the Mass. Believe it or not, in those days before I left, we used to have 14 Masses a week in the parish of Richmond Hill. And we had a congregation at each of them. And that was a lot of services to take place. So you can imagine not doing that was a massive change in my life. So being invited to become a priest vicar at the cathedral and going on the rota to celebrate the Eucharist even once a week was a real gift to me. But ordinarily, I would be walking behind Bishop Roy. It was Bishop Roy Williamson, who had been Bishop of Bradford, before he then moved from Bradford down to Southwark. And he was a Northern Irish, Belfast-born evangelical who knew nothing about the kind of hijinks that went on in Southwark Diocese and Southwark Cathedral. So he purposefully went out to find somebody who came from a more Catholic tradition to be able to help him to understand what to wear or what he needed to take or what they meant or what was meant to do. And that was wonderful to work with Roy. Well, a lovely, lovely guy he was. But I would normally be walking behind him in the cathedral, looking after his hat and stick, his mitre and crozier, making sure that he had the correct order of service and it was all marked up so he knew when to say something. You know, that's the best way to deal with bishops, making sure that they say something when you need them to say something and not when you don't. They're much better like that. That he had the text of his sermon in the pulpit and he knew precisely what he was doing. Roy hated anything where he felt that he didn't know exactly what he was going to do next, and I can understand that entirely. It meant dressing up in nice things. I have to be honest, it's quite nice if somebody's laid out something in cloth of gold for you and you just have to wear it. It meant listening to beautiful music, hearing good sermons. It's really, I'm sure you have wonderful sermons here in Adel, but a lot of places I've been to, I haven't heard very good sermons. It was a treat hearing good sermons. It meant being part of ordered and planned and well-executed liturgy, and above all, it meant being welcome and loved for who I was and for who I am. One of my favourite films is The Wizard of Oz, the proper Judy Garland version. The thing that I love about it is that incredible transition between black and white and Technicolor. If you've seen it, you'll know what I mean. Dorothy and her dog, Toto, are caught up in a storm and a twister hits their little house on the plains in Kansas. The house is caught up in the tornado and lands with a bump, we know not where. Dorothy comes to and gathers Toto in her arms. She opens the shack door and steps from a black and white world into one vibrant with colour. She famously says to her dog, "Toto, I've a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." I loved Leeds and I loved Ripon Diocese, but stepping into the cathedral in Southwark was like stepping from Kansas into Oz. The degree of inclusive welcome was extraordinary and honest and sincere and overwhelming. It revealed, for me, a God who loved me as I am, for who I am, and who wanted me to be more the person who God had created me to be than I previously felt I could be. I'll come back to why that might be and what it says about cathedral ministry a bit later. But first, and I'm probably teaching you all to suck eggs, but I'm going to sort of fill in a bit of what cathedrals are in general and in historical terms, if that's okay. So right back to the beginning. Following Easter and Pentecost, I mean right back to the beginning, following Easter and Pentecost and Paul's missionary journeys, the Christian church as we know her began to emerge. It had, though, two foci. Christianity was very much an urban religion. Paul wrote to the Christians in cities: Rome, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi. There are other letters, of course, like Galatians, but in the main, he wrote to Christians in the city. This urban character remains today and has modern-day implications. 10 years ago, when this new diocese was being established, there was, how can we put it, a bit of a spat in General Synod, of which I was part. The proposal was that the new diocese, and you may well remember this, would be called West Yorkshire and the Dales, which sounds logical, except that's not how it works. It had to be named after a city, a place, an urban place, not an area, which is why it ended up being called Leeds. It couldn't be called Wakefield or Bradford or Ripon, of course, because that would be too divisive to move on to something. So that's why it's called Leeds and not West Yorkshire and the Dales. So cathedrals ended up in urban places, and in the end, and especially in England and the UK as a whole, became part of the definition of what a city is. The only cathedral not to be named after a city is St. Paul's. St. Paul's. Never called London Cathedral. Never ever called London Cathedral. Because I suppose of what was happening south of the river where Southwark is. because of the complicated nature of London. But the rest, York, Chichester, Exeter, Bristol, and the others are all cities. So one focus of the early church was bishops and their urban cathedrals. The other was abbots and their monasteries in the desert. St. Anthony of Egypt led the flight away from the cities into the wild places, the lonely, silent places, to the deserts, the wilderness, whatever wilderness in that area looks like. It could be a nice valley in North Yorkshire, but that's the equivalent of wilderness. As monasticism expanded across Europe and the world, in time, some of that distinction was lost as monastic settlements became cathedrals and created cities, like Durham. But this is where it began. One of the defining dates in all of this was AD 313, and Emperor Constantine's edict that set the Christian church free and allowed bishops to operate with authority, secular as well as religious. Bishops now needed a seat from which to exercise that authority, a seat of teaching, of oversight, a seat, a throne from which they could preside. And that chair was called a cathedra, and the church in which it was set, a cathedral. So if you want to identify what a religious building is, if you go in and there's a cathedra, then it's a cathedral. And so basically a cathedral is a roof, not to keep the rain out of the organ, as cathedral organists imagine, but to keep the water off the cathedra, which is the seat of the bishop. But interestingly, post-Reformation in this country, and this is where we are so different from Roman Catholic cathedrals, the bishop has no rights in the cathedral. So she has their chair there of authority and of teaching, their cathedra, but they have to ask the permission of the dean in order to go and sit in it. So that's why bishops, when they're enthroned, have to bash on the closed door 3 times with their crozier in order to be admitted. And why I would always have to write a letter to the bishop to invite the bishop to come and preach in his own cathedral, because it's not his own cathedral really, or her own cathedral. It's a kind of it was an effort by under Elizabeth I, the Elizabethan settlement, to create this creative tension within the Church of England. So bishops didn't have all the power and authority. Quite a bit of it was vested in the deans and chapters of cathedral. And one could hold the other to account. That's the theory. Bishops hate it, of course. They would love to overturn some of that, some of them would. Because deans can do what they like and be as outrageous as they like and push the boundaries as much as they like and cause problems for bishops as much as they like. And bishops can do very little about it apart from have a visitation. And they only do that because it's a bit of a nuclear option. So Elizabeth I's Elizabethan settlement really set the pattern of how we behave. In the Roman Catholic Church, the bishop of the diocese, or the bishop of Leeds, is basically the vicar of the cathedral. And the person who calls themselves a dean there, which there is a dean there, is the curate to the bishop. So it doesn't have the same authority as an Anglican dean does. During the 10th and 11th centuries, the cathedral clergy became more definitely organized and divided into 2 classes. One was that of the monastic establishment of some recognized orders of monks, often the Benedictines or Augustinians, while the other class was that of a college of clergy, bound by no vows except those of their ordination, but governed by a code of statutes or canons, hence the name of canon given to somebody in a cathedral. It's because we follow a set of rules called canons. In this way arose the distinction between the monastic and secular cathedral churches, which is the difference, for instance, between St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which was never a monastery, never ever a monastery, and Canterbury Cathedral, which we know, of course, because of Thomas Becket and everything, was a Benedictine monastery at its heart. So what exactly is a cathedral? Well, I've just said that technically it's the church in which the bishop's cathedra is set, but that's just the beginning. Cathedrals are complex places. Because this diocese has 3 cathedrals, there are not 42 Church of England cathedrals, one for each diocese, but 44. And they are all very different whilst trying to do very much the same thing. Yet each sings a different song. So I want to just read you a poem from this collection of poems by J. Hume called The Backwater Sermons. It's an interesting set of poems. He was homeless, or they were homeless, he's actually trans, but came into the ambit of Leicester Cathedral and came to faith in that way. But this is one that they wrote called Cathedral Song. It is night, and I am watching the cathedral like an avid twitcher. I identify every wing. Look, there she sits. See the shadows of the floodlights, the curved details, that Romanesque flourish, splicing into Gothic, into grandeur, into gone. She's flying into dreams again, each stone a compendium of prayer, first formed by the hands of men long dead, yet still she speaks, song and silence synthesized into the sound of the sacred. She is an instrument of interpolation, an organ built entirely of time. Each life that is lived adds syllables to centuries of song. Like any good twitcher, I see by silhouette, move slowly so as not to scare her off. Listen closely. Now, each cathedral sings with a slightly different sound. I love that final line. Each cathedral sings with a slightly different sound. I've already mentioned Coventry. There were some interesting things said in an address given by Albert van der Heuvel during the rededication after the rebuilding of that cathedral in 1966. He was reflecting on this very topic of what a cathedral was or is. And he suggested these, in what he said, as a series of descriptors. So he said a cathedral is a sign of pro-existence, a symbol of diversity in unity, a Pentecostal laboratory, a theatre of basic drama, a temple of dialogue, a centre of creativity, an academy of committed information, a clinic for public exorcism, an international exchange, a broadcasting station for the voice of the poor, a tower of reconciliation, a motel for pilgrims, a house of vicarious feasts, the hut of the shepherd. I mean, it's a really interesting way of describing a cathedral. I think every cathedral, if they were reading that, would think, okay, how can I possibly be all those kinds of things? And I'm not sure that any cathedral can be all those kinds of things. But then one of those vocations really comes to the fore. So thinking of Coventry in particular, Coventry's vocation coming out of the Second World War has been to be that centre of reconciliation, to represent reconciliation both in the nation, but particularly in relation to Germany, to the traumas post-war, but extending that out. So out of that experience, the community of the Cross of Nails was formed, which you may be familiar with. So when the canons went into the ruins of the former cathedral, the bombed out, burnt out ruins, they found some of the medieval nails from the roof timbers lying there on the floor. And they formed them into the shape of a cross. And that cross of nails is on the high altar in Coventry. And replicas of it are around the world. So there's one in St George's, Cape Town, there's one in Southwark Cathedral, there's one in Lambeth Palace. And that ministry of reconciliation goes out across the world. And that is their USP, really, Coventry. And different cathedrals will have different sense of vocation. The new cathedrals measure, which came into force in 2021, puts the whole thing more prosaically, of course, because it's a legal document. A person on which a function is conferred by or under this measure must, in exercising that function, have due regard to A, the fact that the cathedral is the seat of the bishop and a centre of worship and mission, and B, the importance of each cathedral's role in providing a focus for the life and work of the Church of England in the diocese. So it has a ministry relating to the bishop, has a ministry being a centre for worship and mission, but also providing a focus for the life and work of the Church of England in the diocese. Nowhere in that legal document does it use a term that we're very familiar with in dioceses. Often talk about the cathedral as the mother church of the diocese. That isn't part of the language that's used in the legal document, but very much in people's minds, that kind of role at the centre of the life of the diocese, or so it should be. But at the heart of cathedral life is the governing body, which is called the chapter. This is nowadays, since that new measure came in, and everybody's chapters were very, very different kind of affairs, and they tried to sort of iron it all out to make it consistent across the board. They're nowadays made up to 12 clergy and lay people. Now, for instance, Westminster Abbey, which is not a cathedral, it was a cathedral very briefly for a few years around the time of the Commonwealth. Their chapter is totally clergy, because that's their statutes, and the king would have to change all of that and everything because it's a peculiar. But every other cathedral now, however old their foundation is, has to have a chapter made up of clergy and laity together, and the laity have to be in the majority. So it's a big change, but it's the dean who must be in priests' orders, at least. So you can have a bishop who's the dean of a cathedral, but it's normally a priest. It's the dean who chairs the meetings of the chapter. The church commissioners pay for there to be a dean and 2 residentiary canons. So they pay directly to the cathedral the stipends of a dean and 2 residentiaries. Deans and residentiary canons get paid slightly more than parochial clergy for some reason, but that's the situation that we have at the moment. And the 2 residentiaries are often the canon precentor, who I've mentioned the name precentor already, whose area of responsibility is the liturgy and the music, and a canon pastor, it may be called, who may have a different title, but whose focus would be people, the congregation, visitors, the staff, the community. So you get 3 people: the dean, who is the head of the chapter, a person who's responsible for the services, and somebody who's responsible for the pastoral care of the congregation. And then in addition, there may be other residentiaries paid for by the cathedral or the diocese. At Southwark, we were as large as cathedrals get, with a dean and 5 residentiary canons, a sub-dean who was pastor, a precentor, chancellor, treasurer, and missioner, who's now called a librarian. And in addition, you can then have minor canons, who are not residentiary canons at all, but they're there to do all the work instead, but you have to pay them separately. So at St Paul's, they have 3 minor canons to work with the precentor at putting together all of the services. We only had one, called the succenter, because the precentor would be the first one to lead the singing in choir, and succenter would be on the other side of choir leading the response. So pre and suc, that's how it all went. The center is derived from cantor. So that's how those names work. Then a big change has come about in that the chapter must have what is called a snem. It's not a very nice word, doesn't sound very nice, but a snem, the senior non-executive member, who is appointed by the bishop and chairs the chapter in the absence of the dean. And they are a layperson, and this caused huge ructions around the cathedrals when it was suggested that the vice chair of the chapter should be a layperson. But there to provide a different perspective, and it's a radical change for sort of 1400, 1500 years of cathedral ministry in this country. They're there to act as a link between the bishop and the chapter, because the bishop cannot be a member of the chapter, but is the visitor, so is the ultimate person who will be brought in if there were a problem. And then the remaining members might include cathedral wardens, the chair of the cathedral finance committee, and others who bring specific skills. And all are trustees, because the chapter and the cathedral is now a registered charity, just as probably this parish is a registered charity. The cathedral will then have staff, paid for by the cathedral. At Southwark, we had around 30 lay staff, vergers, musicians, administrators, education officers, shop staff, a maintenance team. St Paul's has around 150 now paid members of staff. Pre-COVID, it was more like 250. So you get the idea that these are big and expensive and complex organisations. The annual budget of Southwark, which is a small cathedral really, is 2.5 million. And all of that basically has to be raised apart from the grant that you get from the church commissioners to do that bit of employing. So we also depended on volunteers. Pre-COVID, we had around 500 volunteers working in the cathedral. And that dropped substantially during the pandemic, obviously, and has been very slow to recover. But the cathedral could not operate without generous, skilled, well-trained and well-managed volunteers, stewards, welcomers, servers, broderers, etc., 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 flower arrangers, I mustn't forget flower arrangers, all keeping the show on the road, really. 2 groups of staff are obviously critical to the life of the cathedral, and when things go wrong, as inevitably they do, and then you read about them in the Church Times, they can be the groups where issues arrive. These groups are the vergers and the musicians. The vergers look after and manage the cathedral. They prepare and help run services. They look after events and are often the front face of the cathedral. If you want to know anything about a cathedral, anything at all, ask a verger. Even if it's none of their business, they will know the answer. They are absolutely critical, key people. The other group are the musicians, the organists, the lay clerks or vicars choral or whatever people call them, choral and organ scholars, and of course the choristers. Of all things people know our cathedrals for, it's the music, the choral music, and especially having a top line sung by children. These children are absolutely superb professionals. I am in awe of the choristers of our cathedrals. They may go to a cathedral school, choir school, but that's now very rare. It's so expensive for a cathedral to run a choir school and extremely complicated. So a lot of cathedrals are now getting rid of their choir schools. Southwark never had a choir school, and most cathedrals are now opting for that kind of Southwark model, where children from a variety of day schools come in to the cathedral after school to do their rehearsal. But it does change what they can do, because at the Abbey, at Westminster Abbey, at St Paul's Cathedral, where they still have their choir schools, the kids go in at the beginning of the day and rehearse. Then they have, their classes, and then they go in after school and rehearse again, and then do evensong. So you get a lot more rehearsal, so you can do a lot more repertoire. But it's a luxury that few can now afford. Almost all the cathedrals have boys and girls, thank God. It took a long time. Salisbury, I think, was the first to do it. But even St Paul's now has girls in the choir. I was at a service there on Friday for the United Guilds service, and there were the first 3 girls processing in with the boys at St Paul's. You cannot believe what a mammoth change that has been, and for St Paul's to be able to do that is absolutely fabulous. There is nothing quite like listening to that golden tone of a boy chorister whose voice is just about to break. It's the most beautiful sound possible. But girls bring longevity to a choir. Our girls used to join, I'm just having to watch the time, our girls used to join when they're 7 and then leave at 17 just before they were sitting their A-levels. So you could get 10 years of a girl chorister singing. And so she would learn a huge repertoire, gaining confidence, a maturing voice, maturing very much, it depends how they're taught, but with real quality. And I have to say that girls bring a different sense of corporate belonging to a choir. Boys will step out of their cassock and walk away from it. Girls will actually pick them up and hang them in a cupboard, so we found. And that's just my experience of girls. What do I know? We took them on choir tour once. If you take boys on a choir tour, you've got to take a few footballs with you. And as soon as you've done a service, you've got to find a field where they can run around and go mad. When we went to Rouen, we came out from singing in the Church of Jeanne d'Arc, a lovely concert. And we actually went to a cafe and sat outside, and they all had an orangina, and we had a coffee, and they sat down and talked like reasonable human beings and did each other's hair, and nobody had to run around. And I was stunned by that, but, some boys don't have to run around, but they are a minority. So, that's basically what a cathedral does. Before I just go on with a few sort of other things, any questions from anybody at that point? That's fine. Okay. So I just wanted to suggest a few things about cathedrals as a whole. So I think cathedrals are very important as a place of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is something that really has grabbed people's imagination nowadays. You may know that more people now walk the Camino to Santiago de Compostela than has happened since the medieval ages. When I went on it was a cheat one because we were mostly on a coach. But when I went to Santiago de Compostela and then went back to an international convention and spoke at it, 1,200 people were arriving each day at the pilgrim office in Compostela. And 90% of those people were requesting the pious certificate. You can get 2 certificates when you arrive. One that says, I walked the Camino to the glory of God, basically. That's the pious certificate. Or you can, I walked the Camino and got this T-shirt kind of certificate. And 90% of the people who walk the Camino, about 1,200 people who arrive every day, ask for the pious certificate. I bet they don't all go to church, not even to Adel. What is happening? Pilgrimage is a way nowadays for people to access the things of faith. And they go to our sacred spaces. And they will come to this sacred space. But they will also access cathedrals, because cathedrals can be open. Because we've got the volunteers and we've got the staff to enable that to happen. And there will often now be a restored shrine there. You know, all the shrines were destroyed apart from the one at Westminster Abbey, because it contained a king, so that one escaped. There's a shrine there, like at St Albans, to go. So there's a purpose in the visit. So I just wanted to read a bit from Little Gidding by T.S. Eliot, which you may well know. If you came this way, taking any route, starting from anywhere, at any time or at any season, it would always be the same. You would have to put off sense and notion. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity, or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. And prayer is more than an order of words, the conscious occupation of the praying mind, or the sound of the voice praying. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Here, the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always. He was reflecting on the little church at Little Gidding, where Nicholas Ferrer had established the first religious community post-Reformation back in the 17th century. Nicholas Ferrer was a friend of George Herbert. In fact, Herbert gave all of his poems to Nicholas Ferrer, who then had them published, because Herbert wasn't sure whether they were worth reading. As we know, that's slightly different, what we think. So, but T.S. Eliot went in there and felt the enormity of this holy place, going there on pilgrimage into this intersection of the timeless moment where prayer had been valid. So I think that the stones themselves carry something very important for people who are on a spiritual journey of one kind or another. And then it's a place in which to light candles. And this is not exclusive to cathedrals, but as I say, they are open. I mean, it's such a shame that so many churches have to be closed, because people need to be able to access church when they need to access church. And I'm not laying guilt on anybody, because it's really, really difficult. But this is where cathedrals and greater churches come into play, because they're able to be open. And people like nowadays to go in and light candles. And I put that down to the awful death of Diana, Princess of Wales. So when that tragedy happened, people kind of responded in an almost medieval way. It was as though people had some kind of folk memory of what you did when you wanted to pray, but you didn't have the words to pray, to be able to pray in words. And they lit candles. And churches that never had candles for using for prayer suddenly went out and got a sand bowl and went down to IKEA and got a load of candles or tea lights or something and set these little places up. And we've never stopped lighting candles. We rediscovered that. And so, I mean, we made a fortune out of candles at Southwark. You know, put your pound coin in or whatever it is that you're asking for. But the candle stands were constantly full. Yeah. Oh, ours were real candles. Yes, yes. They're not like the Roman Catholic ones where it's like an electric. You know, yeah, that's terrible. That was not in Vatican II, so don't blame Vatican II for that. Yeah, real candles that burn for a time and run down, but represent your prayer when you've gone out, because you can't be there the whole time that the candle is burning, for instance. Some more words of Eliot's. This is from Choruses from the Rock. We thank thee for the lights that we have kindled, the light of altar and of sanctuary, small lights of those who meditate at midnight and lights directed through the coloured panes of windows, and light reflected from the polished stone, the gilded carven wood, the coloured fresco. Our gaze is submarine, our eyes look upward and see the light that fractures through unquiet water. We see the light, but see not whence it comes. O light invisible, we glorify thee. So a place of pilgrimage, a place in which to pray, in which to light candles, a place in which it's easy to go to church. Now, what I said about me not really understanding how to do that, but there is something for those who have never been into a church. Coming through that door is a massive thing. It isn't for us because we kind of know what to do when we get inside a church. We know how to behave. Doing baptisms is sometimes an interesting experience, isn't it? When people come in and they're not quite sure whether it's all right to vape in church or do anything else, and it depends where you were doing this. There's a lack of kind of cultural understanding in a way. And it's as weird for somebody to come in here as it might be for us to go into a mosque and feel slightly uncertain, what do I do with my shoes and all the rest of it, or go into a temple, what am I expected? What's my behavior expected to be in this place? These are weird places. But people do access services, religion, particularly at certain times of the year, in our cathedrals, in our churches as a whole, but cathedrals because they hold a lot of folk, do attract people. There's, I love Wendy Cope's poetry. Don't know if you've come across Wendy Cope. And this is a little book called Christmas Poems, and it's a bit cheeky, as Wendy Cope's poems often are. And this poem is called Cathedral Carol Service, and this might be some people's experience. Those of us who are not important enough to have places reserved for us, and who turned up too late to get a seat at all, stand in the nave aisles or perch on stone ledges. We shiver in the draught from the west door. We cannot see the choir, the altar, or the candles. We can barely see the words on our service sheets. But we can hear the music, and we can sing for the baby whose parents were not important enough to have a place reserved for them, and who turned up too late to get a room at all. And I think places, I was saying about feeling welcome, for me personally, Andrew, I think cathedrals have become places of what I'd term radical inclusion. Cathedrals can accommodate people like you and me, with all our differences and challenges and all the rest of it. And cathedrals can do it because they're larger and they tend to have more places where you can just separate yourself out if you want to, where you can get lost amongst crowds, where you're not so obvious, where that you suddenly will look around and there may be somebody else who looks a bit like you. I remember walking down when St. Paul's was being cleaned and they had various hoardings up. And it was sort of, as you do with a hoarding, you put kind of messages on, extolling your virtues or whatever, nice place to be or lovely windows. And it said, good place to be anonymous. And thank you, you're laughing. And we were walking down in a clergy procession, we were going, fancy putting that up. But the more I've thought about it, the more important that can be. The worst thing in the world, isn't it? And now I'm retired. And I often go to church not like this any longer, so people don't know I'm a vicar. I walk into church and there's only sort of half a dozen people, and you feel as though you're going to be on the coffee rota next week if you linger around too long. And I don't want to be on the coffee rota. And And people can feel very, very vulnerable where things, you can get lost in a cathedral in a good way. You can also get lost in a cathedral in a bad way, in that people don't notice you and pick you up. But hopefully, if the congregation is attuned to the kinds of folk who are going to be coming through and are sort of ready and looking out, that doesn't happen as much. But you want people to be sensitive to recognise that there are some people who just will come in and cry and want to do that, need to do that. And there are some folk who are crying who need someone to go and sit alongside them at that moment. And that takes quite a bit of training to do for those volunteers who do it. I mean, one of the... so I've mentioned safeguarding already, and that's obviously a big issue for the Church of England, and there was the interview with Justin Welby yesterday on the Laura Koonsberg thing. Our big safeguarding issue, yes, of course, it was around choristers and our work with young people and all the rest of it. But the number of vulnerable people who came into the cathedral, because we were close to Guy's Hospital, we were close to London Bridge Station, there were lots of people living on the streets or begging on the streets or this, that and the other. There's loads of asylum seekers, refugees, you can imagine in South London. And it's the vulnerable people who find themselves in cathedrals, finding a warm space, who need caring for. And that was the major place where we needed to be attuned to our safeguarding, but also the safeguarding of our volunteers. Because everybody becomes vulnerable in that sort of situation. And we just need to take care of one another, everyone, all of us. The people who come through the doors, but also the people who are already inside. And we became very friendly with the poet laureate, the last one, Carol Ann Duffy, not the Leeds one writing in his shed in his back garden, Simon Armitage, but Carol Ann Duffy. And she came along to Southwark and she wrote us a poem. And this is Carol Ann Duffy's poem. And when I retired, one of the best things that they gave me, and lots of things they gave me, she wrote it out by hand for me, and it was framed and signed by her, this particular poem, which is called A Human Haunt. St Mary Overy, St Saviour Southwark, over the river, a human haunt in stone, 1,000 years here, the sweet Thames well recalls. Who came? Nuns, brothers, in good faith, saints, poets. John Gower, whose blind head, look, rests on the pillow of his books. Chaucer, imagining the pilgrim's first steps on the endless written road we follow now, good readers. Shakespeare, with 20 cold shillings for a funeral bell. Players, publicans, paupers, politicians, princes, all to this same persistent, changing space between fire and water, theatre and marketplace. Us, lighting our candles in the calm cathedral, future ghosts, eating our picnic on a bench. And I loved the way she kind of captured so much of the history of the place and the characters the ghosts who wandered around Southwark. It starts with St Mary Overy, the Saxon convent that was established there. People say around 606, but there's no actual evidence for that, but as good as they said any. The church was called St Mary Overy, strangely, but it means over the river. So it was over the river from London, which was over there, whereas this was over here. That's how I tried to get people. We're over here, Overy, they're over there. So that was what it was originally called. And at the Reformation, it became St Saviour's. Then when it became a cathedral, it was called St Saviour and St Mary Overy. So they brought back the Saxon medieval name for it. And finally, a place of persistence, I've called it. A place that is firmly established. I mean, Peterborough Cathedral, thank God, has just raised its 300,000. It's on the news today that it was going bust again. And the Church of England won't let I mean, Bradford went through its dreadful times when it also went bankrupt. But the Church of England is very much behind our cathedrals and will attempt as far as possible to keep them going because we're firmly established in the landscape and within the landscape of the Church of England and need to be for the structures that we have. And I love the poems of, the sonnets of Malcolm Guite, who you may have come across Malcolm Guite. And Malcolm has a running column in the Church Times, but he also produces some wonderful books of sonnets and other poem forms. And this one is called York Minster, which I was going to conclude with, because it's kind of homely, isn't it? I walked upon your walls in late November as bonfires flickered in the Minster garden. The smoke of smouldering leaves beset your stones and withered in a drifting swirl of mist, through which I glimpsed the ghosts of other flames, the burnings of another age's winter. I saw your blackened beams against the snow and dragon longships, frozen in the ooze, the blood axe, and his kindred bearing torches, wading ashore from off the wasted Whale Road. In you they found a vulnerable haven, the subtle windings of their swimming tongue uncoiled at last in your accepting peace. Your loosened blood has patiently outloved them, has blessed and broken every pagan heart. Their scattered bones are flaxen English seed, Freke and Freya, Loki of the flames, Woden hanging 9 days on the tree, wooed by the word, at last succumbed to you. York Minster, broken bone house, broken home of broken bread, in all your funeral rites you witness resurrection. 7 times your skeleton has crumbled into ash, a live impossibility. Remember us, your unremembering children. Stand up, old stones. Hold in your bones the light, the dispensation to each pilling year of love's abiding truth. Treasure your relics. And in the pitch of penitential psalms, prepare a place to keep your people safe before the flaming of the final siege. The cathedrals, I think, remain the jewel in the crown of the Church of England, and I was so blessed to be able to serve 24 of my 40 years of stipendiary ministry at Southwark. From being someone unimpressed by cathedrals, I was won over and became a huge advocate for them and still am. But can they be all things to all people in an increasingly fractured, impoverished, and nervous church? If we can, how can we be truly prophetic and provocative? And should we be? Thank you.
That's all sorts of things swirling around in my head, and they know that I'm a lover of poetry, so that's been great. And yes, they have heard quite a lot of Malcolm Guite, one way and another. Questions? I have a couple, but I don't know if anybody else wants to get in before me. Jill?
I wonder if you could kindly give us a flavour of a typical day, other than the services, the things that the volunteers do, the other activities that might be going on.
Yeah.
Because you're open all day, you've got lots of people visiting, perhaps particularly the vulnerable, the things that you offer them. Is food offered? Perhaps you could let us know a bit more about a typical day.
I mean, there isn't really a typical day, to be honest, but the day is framed in worship. So I have to say that because it's what the place is for. So at Southwark, post-COVID, I'll talk about post-COVID. Before COVID, we had morning prayer at 8 o'clock, Eucharist at 8:15, and then in COVID, we changed that because we did morning prayer online at 9, and that became so popular. It's got a huge congregation, online congregation even now. So we got rid of the early Eucharist, and morning prayer is 9. And then there's midday prayer at 12:30, a Eucharist at 12:45, evensong every day at 5:30. So that's the kind of structure into which everything else fits. So then, I mean, for clergy, it may well be that there's lots of meetings, to be perfectly honest. A lot of my day, particularly when I was dean, was spent either chairing or in a variety of meetings. Meanwhile, on the cathedral floor, volunteers will start arriving. So there would be a team of welcomers on duty, so they would be there for when people came through the door to say welcome and to give them details of how to find things in the church and answer their questions. There would be a team of day chaplains on who would lead the prayers on the half hour, every hour. And they would also be there to sit with people and talk to them and pray with them if that's what they wanted. And if somebody came in and wanted to make their confession, they would then send a message up to us, clergy in the office, and one of us would run down and throw a stole on and hear their confession and that kind of thing. On a Friday, Pat would arrive. She'd have pre-prepared her flowers back at home, and she would arrive to do 2 big flower arrangements with another couple of, normally ladies, but not totally ladies. There were some gentlemen who helped do the flowers as well. And that would always cause a lot of interest for visitors. They would want to come and ask about flowers. And she, as she reminded me almost daily, she was gold at Chelsea. And so she knew exactly, she could torture blooms like nobody else. But absolutely fantastic flower arrangements. There would be somebody whose volunteer job was to come in and do some dusting, because there was a lot of things to dust, and so a number of people would come in and be doing that. Meanwhile, there would be, all of a sudden, a couple of classes of kids arrive who had gone to the learning centre, where the education officer who was employed would be preparing them to go up to the cathedral floor, and they would be doing one of the trails. They might be doing monasticism, they might be doing Tudors, they might be doing Victorians, they might be doing some maths thing, how do you work out how high the building is by measuring and doing that sort of trigonometry, or whatever it's called. I can't remember now. I was never very good at that. So they will do all those kinds, or little kids, the little ones doing awe and wonder. What's it feel like to be in a big space? And what do you smell and what do you hear? So they would be doing that, and there'll be volunteers working with them, because if you've got a class of 30, you would have one person who's teaching them, as it were, and then you would have another load of people who were making sure that they were safe and happy. So they would be going round. And you forever got the organists trying to get practicing. And they would be so desperate to get to the organ and to pull all the stops out. This is where you get the rows, you see. So the organist would have all the stops out and playing something French and tortuous. And the people in the education, they couldn't hear the kids speak. And Pat, who was doing the flowers, would have ears bleeding. And they would come and moan to the vergers, who would then come and moan to me. And I'd try and pour oil on troubled water. That didn't happen very often, but you can imagine those sort of things do. Then it might be that if it was a Tuesday afternoon, somebody from one of the conservatoire in the London area would come along and give some sort of recital, which happened every Tuesday, and so they would bring their instruments, they'd get some rehearsal time and do that, so there'll be a nice little crowd. And then the choir would arrive in the afternoon later on, and if it was all possible, it was best if they could rehearse in the cathedral, because they could do that with the organ. So they would do a rehearsal, then dash into the song school in order to get ready, put their surplices on, and we'd all turn up. In the evening, we would have our chapter meetings and other meetings, a bit like you would have a PCC in the evening, because most of our people were at work, and so we would have the meetings in the evening. Or it might be that there was a study session. Or it might be that there was a concert, in which case, if there was a concert, hardly anything would have happened in the cathedral during the day, because the vergers would have to have built a stage and tiered seating, and you would have to get all the instruments in. Southwark is quite a small cathedral, so if there's one thing happening, that's basically what's happening. It's quite difficult. So there can be a huge number of things, and then there are people coming and going all the time and visiting. And there'll be people working in the shop, trying to flog bits, and there'll be people in the refectory serving coffees, not volunteers, all of that was sort of franchised out. So enormously complicated, and I would be there sort of looking like a swan.
Thank you. Gillian.
I wonder what your opinion is of some cathedrals charging visitors for admission between the services.
Thank you for asking that. We had it on our agenda every year, and just so that we could check in with each other that we didn't want to charge. And during my time, and I'm sure Dean Mark Oakley, who's my successor, the wonderful Mark Oakley, I'm sure he will continue that, because one of the things that we liked about being in London, the Abbey and St Paul's both charge quite a lot of money to go in. Southwark didn't charge at all, so it was completely free access, and that was part of our USP, really. If you're going to talk about yourself as inclusive, which we did all the time, you want anyone to be able to go in. I mean, I don't think any deans like having to charge. So if we now brought the College of Deans here, sat them all down, they wouldn't say it's fantastic charging. They have to do it because they are terribly expensive places to run. And some cathedrals just simply could not manage. So they tried to mitigate it in lots of ways, and so regular visitors will be able to, from the diocese sometimes it's arrangements, but it's tough. It's a reality. I mean, so what then happens is people go into commercial stuff. So somebody will put a helter-skelter in the middle of their nave, or crazy golf, or a Lego, build the cathedral in Lego, or some other kind of big silent disco, all of that stuff that we had in the press about silent discos. They will have a Taylor Swift concert evening, somebody coming in and singing all Taylor Swift things. We had lots and lots of, it's obviously very high class at Southwark. We had lots of lovely Mozart by candlelight sort of things where we could make money so that we didn't have to charge. But then people would come in and moan because they couldn't see the place properly because everything had been set up for the, Mozart by candlelight. So it's a constant battle because in our instance, we didn't have historic funds that we could draw upon. So we had to run ourselves as a business, but hopefully as a good business and as a church. But one way or another, you've got to get the funds in. So.
Thank you. Very, very, very interesting. And I particularly liked your reference to the hoarding, where saying the cathedral was a good place to be anonymous, because believe you me, being somebody who is on some diocesan committees and that sort of thing, to actually go into a cathedral somewhere else where nobody knows you is wonderful, where you can just pray and be. But I was going to ask you a particular thing relating to Southwark Cathedral, where we happened to visit at the beginning of the year, and saw probably a successor there too. But I read a book quite recently, which had a whole chapter devoted to Dorcas Magnificat.
Dawkins.
Well, I was nearly right.
You were nearly right.
And I just wondered whether that was during your tenure at Southwark or not.
So Dawkins Magnificat was our first cathedral cat. And my mum would never allow us to have pets apart from one of those goldfish that you got from the fair that died the next day. That was long enough for my mother. So we weren't brought up with animals. So I couldn't claim to be, and I'm saying this now because I'm no longer Dean of Southwark, so I couldn't say that I was a huge cat fan. But I had to become one. I had to become a friend of Dawkins. Dawkins was not the easiest cat to be a friend to. So the story is that this little cat, she was very little, she used to arrive in the churchyard every morning, and the vergers who opened up, they had the keys, noticed this little cat, and they put a bowl of water out for the cat, and she drank the water, and then of course she came for the water, and then they put some food out for her, and then she ate the food, and then eventually she found her way into the building, but she was very, very nervous. She was also very, very nasty. So she was not a cat that you could touch because she'd take your hand off. But she made the place her home in her own way. And we lived alongside each other. And we would feed her, she would sleep most of the day, she'd go out at night, go and do whatever she wanted in the borough market. And then she'd be back in the morning, have a bit more to eat, sleep the whole day. Kids had started to come in to try to find her, and we'd have to warn them not to sort of disturb her. And she would find all these places around the cathedral. She used to change the place where she slept all the time. And so it was all kind of good fun. And she became very popular and very saleable. So we tried to sort of make money on the back of the cat. We exploited the cat. She actually arrived when my predecessor was in post, Colin Slee, who was a great cat lover. So he wanted the cat to be there. And Dawkins must have known that Colin loved her because he very sadly died very, very quickly. He was a great character. But within 6 weeks of being diagnosed with cancer, he was dead. And his body was received into church before his funeral. And Dawkins spent the night sleeping under his coffin. So she was there. And you may remember in 2017, we were not the target, but caught up in an act of terrorism with the London Bridge and Borough Market attack in which 8 people were killed. And Dawkins was out and about, as she would be every evening in the Borough Market when that all happened. We were locked out of the cathedral for a week, and obviously there was plenty of things to be concerned about, but one of the things we were concerned about was Dawkins. So we contacted the Met and said to them that our little cat was somewhere. Well, bless them, they got some food and put the food out for Dawkins and made sure that she was all right. We arrived back when we were allowed back into the area, and she came immediately back into the cathedral. She never went out again. What she had experienced that night, I do not know, but she would not go out. So from that point onwards, she lived in the cathedral, totally. And we had to have the alarms changed on her behalf, so she wouldn't set the alarm off. But, the trauma that the community experienced that night, she shared in that. And so people took her even more to their hearts, really. And she became very, very frail, not long after that. And the head verger finally took her, because she became a little bit blind and would fall down the steps. And she fell down the steps in front of one of the school groups, and that was it. We decided that she had to go now to Paul's house. And she slept under his radiator, and she was much nicer in old age. I mean, some people get nicer in old age, don't they? And she passed away there, and she's buried in the... we had a... Then it was during COVID, and we held a memorial service for her, which is... I think you can probably still find it online. I got lots of complaints about how... But I got more thanks. And I think... I don't know how many, Mark, I don't want to exaggerate the numbers, but it was like 300,000 people watched that service online and said it helped them through the trauma, that we could actually be nice to a little cat and say nice things about it. We didn't know what to do. But the day that Dawkins died, we decided that we were going to have to replace, because we wanted a cat. And this little boy cat arrived from a rescue centre. And I've kind of forgotten his name now. Hodge. And he'd been badly treated. He'd been living in a shop in Woolwich, and they'd been horrible to him. And so he'd been taken into care. And he came along to see whether he liked us, and he liked us, and we liked Hodge. And he was completely different to Dawkins, and would be on your knee and wanted to cuddle and wanted to stroke. And when they said his name's Hodge, and we said, well, that's an odd name. But actually, it was the name of Dr. Johnson's cat. And if you go near to Johnson's house off Fleet Street ever, there's a statue to Hodge there. And so we kept the name Hodge, and he's absolutely lovely. He eats continuously. People love stroking him, and a lot of people come into church, and they have done, to find the cat, and end up lighting a candle and saying a prayer. And if that's what brings them into church, I don't mind. Because when they come into church, they will encounter Jesus, because we weren't frightened about talking about Jesus. So if that's their routine, hallelujah. I'm not meant to say that in Lent, are you? But, do you know what I mean? There are many rooms in my Father's house, says Jesus to us. And I think that all of these are access points to God. I haven't got a cat, by the way.
Thank you. We have a church dog.
Oh, have you?
Charlie dog sits on a Monday afternoon. And the visitors book doesn't often mention Hillary, but it quite often mentions Charlie. So I just realised I've lost track of time. I had a question actually about, you've obviously talked about visitors, people coming for all sorts of reasons. I presume you do also have a congregation, a church family. How does that work in a cathedral?
Well, the thing I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, and why didn't I mention it, is that there are two sorts of cathedrals amongst all of the cathedrals. There are the cathedrals that are old foundations, like Durham, York, St Paul's, those kinds, which have never been a parish church. And then there are the parish church cathedrals, of which Wakefield, Bradford, Ripon's a bit peculiar, because it has a parish church element to it. Southwark, Leicester, all these places were created cathedrals either at the end of the Victorian era or in the sort of early Edwardian, because of the burgeoning growth, the growth of cities, of industrial areas and all the rest of it, and they needed cathedrals. So we were a parish church, and we had a real parish, and we loved our parish, and we had a parish school, so we were onto a winner already. But we had a big congregation. Mark, what did we have? About how many on the electoral roll? About 500, 600 on the electoral roll. And the congregations are big there. Why? Because I think it's very welcoming, and there's good sermons, and the liturgy is always well done, and the music. But also because we were very, very confident about who we were, about who they are. So, you can't be all things to all people. So we were definitely in that South Bank liberal Catholic, prepared to sort of test the boundaries, test the edges, try things out kind of environment, that was confident about our faith, that believed in the tenets of the faith and would proudly proclaim those, but also want to say, yes, we agree with the ordination of women. But, Southwark was there right at the beginning, pressing for the ordination of women to the diaconate priesthood, the episcopate, saying, yes, we support LGBT rights, and we're not going to be cowed into thinking that that's wrong. Yes, we support people from all racial backgrounds. Yes, we support people of all abilities. That's really important. That's what Jesus would do. It's not about being woke. I mean, everything's being now scaled back again, as though there's something wrong about thinking about other people's needs. It's absolutely primary. And we weren't going to be ashamed about that or cowed about it. Lots of people sort of derided Southwark at various times for, oh, it's them again. Trying to upset the apple. Why are you asking these questions? Why are you pressing on this? But it's because people like John Robinson, back in the 1950s, published a book, Honest to God. And that was the biggest selling theological book, apart from the Bible, for a very, very long time. And that book was formative, really, as to the future direction of the Church of England. He was Bishop of Woolwich, and he created this movement that was called South Bank religion. And lots of people think it means believing nothing. My friends, it doesn't mean believing nothing, but it does mean knowing what you believe and being confident about that, and being willing to question and being willing to try. And I think that having that confidence enabled us to grow as a congregation as well, because there are a lot of people out there who are interested in religion, and they don't just want it kind of neatly packaged and delivered to them, because they're more intelligent than that.
Thank you. Oh, Hilary.
Sorry, you got me going on one then.
No, it's very good.
Please, could you pray that pilgrim poem, the pilgrimage prayer?
The one I started with?
Yes, before we go.
Of course.
I don't know when you're finishing, but would you do that?
Neither do I, because I'm not in control.
I did sell it to you by saying we'd be over by 8:30, but if there's more questions, does anybody have another
Please.
pressing question before we leave?
Ask me what
Thank
my
you.
favourite things were.
What are your favourite things, Andrew?
Oh, well, so I just love the fact that I got to meet some of the most incredible people. So I got to hear Desmond Tutu preaching a couple of times from the pulpit. He was amazing. He didn't have to say many words. It just kind of flowed out of him. Just flowed out. I got to sit next to Nelson Mandela, who came to open our new buildings. And he needed somebody, not that he was daft or anything, but he needed somebody with the order of service just to show him where we were. And I had the privilege of doing that. And what a man of humility and gorgeous stature and everything. And welcoming Her Majesty the Queen on a couple of occasions. And being able to talk to the Queen. And Victor Stock, who was the Dean of Guildford, said to me, don't listen to what the palace tell you. Because the palace tell you that you mustn't initiate conversation. You can only respond to what Her Majesty says. He said, don't do that. Just think of her like your grandma. So I tried to. The principal time that Her Majesty came, they'd been up the Shard, her and the Duke of Edinburgh. And she got out of the car and she said to me, she said, I'd almost lost the Duke of Edinburgh, she said, up the Shard, because the Borough Market presented him with a hamper of food, and she said he was so fascinated about what was in the hamper that he missed the lift. And she was so funny, and on the back of that, we just had a conversation about how difficult husbands are, or whatever. It was lovely, and she was so engaging and so interested. And then the wonderful lay people you meet, absolutely incredible people. Irene, who sat on the front row always, came over from Jamaica, early 60s, to work as a seamstress in Manchester. Nobody told her it was going to be as cold and wet as it was in Manchester, so she found her way down to London. They'd only got a one-way ticket, So whether she liked it or not, she couldn't go back. Made all her own clothes, came to church to every service, absolutely fantastic, annoying. She was one syllable behind everybody else in church. But that's what's so wonderful. So it's the great and the good, and the great and the good.
Thank you. I think we show our appreciation to Andrew again. And now that I know that you tend to accept invitations, you might find yourself preaching here, because I hear far too much from me.
Might I?
So yes, indeed.
that'd be nice.
But it would be lovely if you would end with that prayer. Thank you.
I will do this again. Let us pray. Loving God, draw us on the journey to the places of holiness, the places of peace, the places of fellowship, the places of encounter, the places of beauty, the places where faith has been lived, your love made known, your hope held out in the past, for the present, into your future. Amen. Thank you. Have a lovely Lent, the rest of it.